Welcome back to my channel, and today I would like to introduce an American psychological thriller horror mystery movie called Regression. Please be aware that there are spoilers. The film opens in his 1990 Minnesota Hoyer, and we see John Gray standing in front of a police station and praying inside his car. A man called John and motioned for him to come to his office. As John sits anxiously, his aide tells him that his daughter lives in a church with a man named Reverend Murray. Then he showed a piece of paper that his daughter had already signed. Another man, Detective Bruce Kenner, enters the room and says his name while recording their voice. He places a recorder near John and asks his name and occupation. The detective questions John about his daughter. John claims he prayed, but he still thinks it's impossible because he can't remember anything. But one thing he is sure of is that his daughter Angela will never lie. Later, John tells Detective Bruce that Angela has been avoiding him and that he is worried. Detective Bruce interrupts and walks up to John and tells him to take off his hat. It turns out that John is going bald due to stress. The detective says that John has confessed and leaves the room, but John does not remember it and the case becomes confusing. Detective Bruce insists that John needs a psychologist and that he must see Angela. The next day, Detective Bruce drives to a house where a large number of police officers are present and encounters a crying woman holding a cat. Her name is Mrs. Gray, and she is Angela's grandmother. Detective Bruce asks her if she knows anything about her case. She claims that her pastor had already told her and that asking her pastor about it made her son John angry. Although she denied all of her police claims, Pastor suggested that Angela should rather stay at the church. Detective Bruce asks permission to search Angela's room. He enters Angela's immaculate room. Unlike the others, he goes and sees their family photos, and he heard a noise and looked out the window to find that the door of a workshop was making the noise by opening and closing on its own. A policeman named George Nesbitt interrupted him. The officer suggests that they should not enter the room without a search warrant, but the detective insists that the woman already allowed them into the room, and then he asks where's her son's whereabouts. George claims he left home 2 years ago and has no idea where he is now. George insists that they shouldn't mention his grandson because it's not a good time to talk about them. Bruce ignores him and continues to ask her if her grandson is running away from his father. She claims that last night her son held her hand and prayed with her, and then looks at her necklace with a cross on it. Later that night, there is mention of the rise of those who pray to Satan. George, a police officer who claims to be close to the Gray family, insists that John cannot force himself on his 17-year-old daughter Angela. Detective Bruce says he heard Angela is a shy girl. George claims that he watched her grow up. He saw how they lived. He also concludes that she lost her mother and that perhaps she wants to run away from reality. Bruce questions George's theory about a 17-year-old girl who sent her father to prison simply because she wanted to change her life. Detective Bruce then sarcastically agrees. At the police station, the police chief, Mr. Cleveland, asks for a report on John Gray. A professor named Kenneth Raines, who is also a psychiatrist, maintains that John's mental state is normal. They cannot find the reason for his sudden memory loss. The professor tells that John denies a lawyer, which means he has not attempted to protect himself. Bruce says that John has already confessed, but he can't remember what he did, and that made people not believe him. They speculate that he may now be repressing his memories and hiding them in a corner of his mind. And finding the key to open it and cause regression is not easy, and then he says infamous sayings that mind is a whole universe. Next, he suggests using regression hypnosis. Detective Bruce then quotes Angela's confession and explains step by step how John coerced her. John feels uncomfortable hearing this. Professor Raines, who is also in the room, tells Bruce to read it again and tells John to concentrate. John begs God to ease his pain. John is hypnotized and sees visions in his head. He then explained it to the professor and detective. The professor confused why John uses the word he. Then John says he sees another man trying to force his daughter to a bed, but he assumed it was him. Professor Raines claims that he must have let someone in, someone he knows. When John focuses on the man's face, he realizes that he is taking a photo of the man, and while he is doing it, he sees George. Detective Bruce is shocked to hear this and runs away from there to find George Nesbitt in sports mode. He catches up with him in the parking lot and informs him that they have a photo of him doing it. George gets scared and Bruce arrests him. Later, George's lawyer then takes an aggressive approach to indicting her client and leaves. Detective Bruce and Professor Raines leave the police station to meet with Angela and identify George as a suspect. Bruce claims that he was suspicious of George from the beginning because of George's strange behavior. When they arrive at the church, they meet Angela, a beautiful young woman. They inform Angela about the man in her room and the ritual her father said. Detective Bruce shows Angela the photos. Bruce calmly suggests that if Angela can write it down for him. Angela was hesitant at first, but then she said she would do it alone, so they leave the room to talk to the pastor. He claims that he met her one day during a meeting at her church and she suddenly started crying. He claims that God spoke to him during this time. Later, Bruce then reads the paper written by Angela and it mentions all the horrors she has experienced. He also saw a picture of an upside-down cross. He is disappointed. He asks Angela who else was with her father. Angela was uncomfortable, but she pointed out a photo of George Nesbitt. Bruce slowly took her hand and tried to comfort her, but she refused and left the room with tears in her eyes. The pastor gives John the paper written by Angela to remind him of the satanic rituals he performed, and he leaves. Later that night, the police chief is in a bar watching the news about satanic rituals and calls Bruce and asks him to turn on the TV and watch the news about satanic rituals. A few hours later, John was asleep, but what he saw woke him up in terror. The next day, police officers held a meeting about the incident and satanic rituals. One police officer claims to have read the book and describes it as a pile of rubbish. Bruce insists the case is complex and should be taken seriously. After the meeting, Bruce and Cleveland talk, and Bruce speculates that he thinks this case is part of something bigger. A police officer intercepted them and claimed to have discovered the location of John's son, who had run away. Professor Raines and Detective Bruce fly to Pittsburgh to find Roy Gray. They discover that Roy lives in an abandoned house with a cat. They inform Roy about his father and the events. Roy claims that John performed satanic rituals and caused his wife to commit suicide due to his drinking problem. Bruce claims in the report he saw that his mother died in a car accident. Roy insists these things didn't happen and becomes confused. The professor suggests that they might find the answer by examining their memories through hypnosis. As the conversation begins, Roy explains when he is in his room. Roy, who is lying on the bed, is surrounded by people wearing black hoods. He says their faces look like witches. The professor urges them to explain what they're doing, but he stops as Roy collapses in fear. On the plane, Professor Raines remembers that something was different in his memory, that he had a vision as a child and saw 6 people performing a ritual, and in their house claimed it was a family of 6. Bruce suspects the grandmother, Rose Gray. Later, the police then searched her house, but she was not happy about it. Bruce tells her he talked to Roy, her grandson, and she hides the location of the photos. She then punched him in the face and she claimed he was lying. She then runs back to her house mourning about it. Later, Bruce then watches George answer questions using a lie detector test. The chief shows them an FBI report on Satanists and rituals, and they believe it's something bigger. Then a phone call came and he arrived at the hospital. The doctor insists on examining Angela's marks. Bruce then goes into the room alone with Angela. He then comforts her with his words. Angela decided to let him see the mark, and when she lifted her shirt, there was a mark on the left side of her stomach. She insists that they both will be killed by the cult since she showed him their traces. Later, Bruce then plays a recording of Angela explaining what happened at her house during the ritual, but it was her grandmother dressed as a Satanist. Bruce follows Angela's instructions and imagines her vision in detail. There is a mention of the workshop door that Bruce noticed earlier. He enters her father's workshop. They were forcing themselves on people and torturing people in cells. The woman makes everyone drink a juice, saying this is not happening and it's all a dream. They brought out a baby, and they began stabbing it, and then they burned the baby's body and buried it on John's property. Bruce is entranced by the vision and feels like they are staring at him. He then rushes outside and takes his breath. In the next meeting, many police officers are involved in the case. Bruce notices Angela at the police station and she claims that someone is following her. Bruce tells her that the public is probably staring at her because her whole town is shocked by the news. Angela claims further that someone was following her shortly before her mother died. Bruce offers to get her statement and get her recorder. Later that night, Bruce takes Angela to church. Angela gives him a Bible, which she claims will protect him. She then says goodnight and Bruce thanks her for her Bible. Bruce slowly makes his way to the street that Angela claims that someone is watching her as he plays Angela's recording. Her mother told her that it's one of their tactics to look at people as death threats. Sometimes they would call and hang up in the middle of the night as a warning and an invitation to join them. Later, Bruce is reading the book he saw on TV, but suddenly the power goes out and he goes to his bed to sleep. At that moment, he sees a light outside of his room. Moments later, a man in a black hoodie grabbed him and covered his mouth. Another man injects something into his arm and he tries to grab the phone, but the man ties his hands to the bed. A woman wearing a red hood was brought in. They take off her hood and then she presses her body against him. People in black hoods begin taking photos as the woman transforms into the grandmother Rose Gray, with white eyes and no pupils. Bruce jumps out and realizes it was just a nightmare until he sees the lights come on and a cell phone hanging under the table. The professor and Bruce visit John in prison, where John has a picture of the devil on his wall. Bruce claims that John is the devil and demands that he confess to murdering his wife. The two then visit Angela and Rose at church. Angela claims that Rose remembers nothing during the ceremony, and she cries. Rose angrily grabs her hand, but Bruce stops her. Professor shows her a picture that John drew them stabbing the baby. Rose becomes furious, claiming that she knows she will never kill a baby. Her pastor offers to take her home. Angela continues to cry. Bruce approaches her and takes her hand. This time she didn't reject him and instead hugged him with her other hand. In the car on the way to Rose's house, she sees a painting of John. The pastor claims they are dealing with the devil. Then Rose sees a photo with red eyes. Later that night, Bruce receives a phone call. He guessed it was the police chief, but no one answered. He then grabbed a gun and locked the door to his room. Rose noticed a cat meowing in the distance. She followed the voice and noticed that the cat was in the workshop. She points her flashlight at her own cat. but she is afraid to see another cat with red eyes, just like the one she saw in John's painting. She returns to her house and locks her door. She hears voices from the TV even when it is already turned off. At that time, she saw blood flowing from under the door, heard the babies cry and jumped out the window. In the morning, Bruce meets with Angela and waits for Rose to confess and that now she has admitted to the hospital. The two then sit at the grave of their mother, Emile Gray. Angela rests her head on Bruce's shoulder. The two then started kissing and realized what they were doing. Bruce looked back and noticed that the Reverend was watching them. Bruce apologizes and leaves. Later, Roy visits her grandmother in the hospital. He then orders Bruce to stop talking to her. She's delirious now. He claims that Professor Raines is a fraud as a psychiatrist, and he also insults the pastor as a preacher. He then orders everyone to leave. In front of the hospital, the pastor presented them with large cross necklaces. Bruce takes the necklace and the pastor leaves. The professor claims that Bruce is scared because he no longer uses his head. Before leaving, a man in a hoodie stares at Bruce, making him uncomfortable. The phone rang again at home, but no one answered. It turns out that it was Angela calling from a payphone. Bruce has another nightmare. One of the men wearing a black hoodie appears to be George. He is then surrounded by a group and hears a baby crying and he tries to run away and screams no. But he realizes that he is covered in blood and has already killed the baby. The woman presents him with a bowl of blood and says this is just a dream. Bruce wakes up with a gun pointed in front of him. Later, at a red light, he noticed many people staring at him. At the police station he learns that George has been released. He panics and grabs his gun and points it at him. His boss and professor try to calm him down in the office. They told him that George had already passed the lie detector test twice. The professor explained that he had received Angela's medical certificate, which stated that the wound was new and that she had inflicted it herself. He also explained to Bruce that a lot of people are staring at him because he looks tired. His boss suggested that he should take a few days off and forget about the incident. The professor hands him a small pill and Bruce pops it into his mouth. As soon as he leaves the office, he takes out the pills and throws them in the trash. Bruce gets in his car and plays a recording of John's first interview with him. Bruce does not notice the car following him. He wants to interview John again and find out more about his family. John claims it's his son Roy. His son is not straight and likes men, so he kicked him out of the house. In their church, they are called sodomites, a sin that people constantly learn from being unregulated. Bruce then realizes that John is only responsible for forcing himself on his daughter to hide his son's sins from the church. Then John broke down and began to cry. At the bar, Bruce realizes that the notes are all worthless and he tears them up. He then looked out the window and saw a sign of a woman who was handing out blood for drinking. He then visits Professor in his house. He explains the woman in an advertisement was in his head. He theorizes that it is not memories, but fantasies induced by the police and the people. The professor asks if that thing about George Nesbitt is true. Bruce still believes George Nesbitt is guilty. They argue and he leaves. When he returns home, a man wearing a double mask attacks him. He gained the upper hand, pointed a gun at the men and demanded they remove their masks. He learned that the two were Nesbitt and another police officer. Bruce insists he won't report this. Instead, he says he wants to know what Nesbitt knows. Nesbitt claims he told him everything in the car that day. Bruce then arrives at the church and requests the pastor to see Angela since the case has already been solved. Angela comes out of her room wearing a nightgown and she cries tears of joy when she hears her news. Bruce asks Angela if the devil worshippers forced her to eat the baby to solve the case. Angela seems to agree with everything he says, but Bruce's notes say nothing. He shows them a piece of paper. The Reverend is shocked, but Bruce insists that he made it all up. Angela asks him why he lied. Bruce explains that Angela doesn't love her family. She hates them all and thinks they're a bunch of drunken losers. And he says George told him that he and Angela are sleeping together. George turned her down because he didn't want to run away with a minor. After that, Angela decided to change her life. The pastor still maintains that Angela is innocent and states that the Lord has already spoken to him. Bruce then kicks him out. Bruce claims that Angela went too far in trying to break up with her family, and she can't stop it now. Angela threatens him that no one will believe him anymore, especially if she tells everyone what he did in the cemetery in front of her mother's grave. Bruce then leaves the church and tells the pastor that he was right all along. Evil exists. Later, a TV reporter on the news explained that police had no evidence of a satanic ritual. The pastor and Angela are shown on television claiming to have seen a devil worshipper kill a baby. Roy and Rose are at the hospital, but are disappointed when they see the news and ignore it. Bruce visits John in prison, but John is confused about what he saw and what he didn't see. Bruce explains that he saw what the police had led them to believe. It was all made up. John has always been a drunk, and he claims that it has ruined his family. It's his fault for putting Angela in the condition she is in now. Bruce blames it. He claims, on his own stupidity. Bruce wants to help John stop punishing him. John demands that he plead guilty and take responsibility, and he does so for Angela's sake, in hopes that one day she will realize it and stop hating him. And the movie ends. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the recap. This will greatly contribute to the growth of your channel.